Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to another Den of Geek chat about all things unexplained, paranormal, supernatural, basically talking about things that go bump in the night. I am your host, Aaron Sagers, journalist, author, researcher of weird topics, currently also the host of Ripley's Believe It or Not, Ripley's Road Trip web series. Check it out on YouTube if you have a minute. And Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel and Discovery Plus, which is now filming its 5th season. And today, we're still in the throes of spooky season of Halloween. I'm very excited to be talking to the creator and host of a podcast that I really can never get enough of. Even though I talk about spooky things for work, I absolutely love listening to Spooked. And Spooked is a Luminary original podcast. It is currently in its 6th season. And not only is it in its 6th season, but for subscribers of the Luminary podcast, there's going to be 26 episodes for this 6th season. So you're going to have to check that out. That's in addition to the episodes that you can check out for free on podcast platforms. So what is Spooked? It gathers listeners from around the world and kind of pulls them into this virtual campfire, this imaginary campfire for hair-raising, true life, supernatural stories. And it's created in the dark of night by Snap Judgment, which is another excellent show that you should check out. Spooked explores the dichotomy between belief and the paranormal, and it asks listeners to oftentimes hold these simultaneously, sometimes conflicting beliefs. And the man with the voice of Spooked, who is our tour guide of the strange and unusual as he uncovers secrets that leaves listeners questioning everything. He's host, he's creator, he's executive producer of Spooked. He's with us here today, Mr. Glynn Washington. I'm going to bring him in. Glynn.
Hey, Aaron. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Happy Halloween and happy spooky season. Of course, it's pretty much you're always working on Spooked, I guess. I mean, even though you guys have downtime, so it's always somewhat spooky season for you, right?
Yeah, right now Spooked is a year-round show. We're just dropped 5 brand new episodes of season 6, and it'll keep going forever from this point. So stay tuned.
Right. Well, it's good to hear. And like I said, I always enjoy listening to the episodes of Spooked. And Spooked, I mean, you do know this. Spooked emerged from Snap Judgment, which you also create, produce, host. How did it emerge? How did it gain a life of its own outside of Snap Judgment?
Thanks, Aaron. So what happened when we first started Snap Judgment? Snap Judgment is a show about first-person storytelling. We ask people that had these amazing stories who've never, shared them publicly for whatever reason it may be, and we ask them to take us, the listener, with them as they recount what happened. And this is a deeply reported musical immersive show, and which we love. And we thought when it got to be time for Halloween, like what are we gonna do? And we just thought, well, why don't we treat the paranormal stories exactly the way we treat everything else? Let's just hear what people say, and this, without that sort of sneer, without that sort of oh really sort of situation. What do people really say? And it's crazy to me. Number one, the impact it had immediately out of the gate to that approach. I have stories that I don't necessarily know how to explain, and I'm not the only one. And it's what's interesting about these stories is that people want to oftentimes dismiss these stories, but these are the stories that affect where you move, affect where you marry, affect so many different aspects of your life. These stories matter. Whatever you want to say about these stories, they matter. They matter because people respond to them. People place them in their own personal histories. And what's interesting, I think, about our culture is that the big questions, where do we go when we die? What happened to Auntie Josephine? Um, what am I here for? We don't talk about those things. We close ourselves off to those things, and oftentimes the only arena that we have to talk about the stories that actually matter to us, that actually have impact to us, end up being around the world of ghost stories, if you want to call them that. And so when we first did that first episode, the response almost immediately was through the roof. And every year we do another Halloween special, do another Halloween special. And finally, we caught on and said, look, we got to give the people what they want. And about 4 years ago, we released Spooked as its own separate show. And we are now in the middle, actually the beginning of season 6.
And I really like how you explain that, because I most certainly agree that when people tell their spooky story, it's really quite easy for, if you wanted to try to poke holes in it or try to debunk it. Some people kind of take that attitude, but at the same time, like, treating it at face value and allowing people to tell the story, it's a deeply personal experience. It's funny because from my perspective, I talk about these things, and you might go into a bar or find yourself in some random gathering. And I've always found it funny that people may start by saying, well, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But they always follow it up with, but there was that one time.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, that yes, but that is when we lean in. Most of the people on Spooked for our show are people who don't necessarily want to tell the story they're telling. They recoil from it themselves. The last thing I want, at least for this particular show, is the person who's wearing 15 crystals and does tarot readings and is into some sort of occult situation. We're trying to get stories from real people, from the nurses, from the pastors, from your construction worker, people who we tend to trust. We tend to, and we know, and that's the whole thing about it. Say what you will, believe it or don't believe it. I think you get the sense that the people who are telling you their stories are not lying to you. They're telling you their truth. And so when we let someone tell their truth, it kind of takes the burden, the onus off. I don't have to explain anything. I don't have some sort of grand understanding that's different from anybody else. I know that I've experienced things that I can't explain. And it's really interesting too, the more we get into this, is that this isn't not just it's not we don't do just I saw ghost stories. That's not really interesting for us. These are experiences of people who've lived with whatever supernatural element it is. They've lived with it over time, and it's affected them over time. Oftentimes, their family members, their girlfriend, or whatever else, they can weigh in on the same exact experience. And you learn about people by examining their monsters. And the stories, as you mentioned earlier, come from all over the world. And people in different parts of the world have different monsters. They have different conceptions of what the supernatural might be. They approach things differently. And it's really this exploration of culture and of space and people. And I think it's not just sort of a supernatural. We're not here to prove to anybody anything. I think I just want to put that out there in the beginning. These are stories, and I think the stories themselves, just for us to put an episode of Spooked on, I want to hear, not that you saw something or somebody did something like that. I want to hear how it affected you. I want to hear what that thing meant to you. I want to hear how you change in response to whatever this manifestation might have been. And I also want to hear how you're different at the end of this process than you are at the beginning. At the end of the day, we're still talking narrative, we're still talking story.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on a lot of people's experiences when it comes to strange things are so brief. It's, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, or there was the time that the doorknob was shaking or whatever. But yes, you tell complete stories. And I'm curious though that as Spooked has gone on, look, I think people want to feel like not just paranormal stories, but people want to feel like there is a safety to telling their story without judgment. They want to be able to come forward and share. Have you found throughout the course of Spooked in particular that there has been this sort of trickle effect that has led to a steady stream that people have through the podcast and through Spooked have discovered that like this is a place where I can come tell my story, and it's welcoming people in. Have you noticed that effect?
Yeah, we're so proud of that actually. Um, it's interesting because even like, the mothership show, Snap Judgment, which I think amazing storytelling from, again, all over the world, people find it very hard to pitch to that show. We're doing a very specific type of thing. We really want first person storytelling. It's not reportage in the same way, but they find it hard to pitch that makes sense for Snap Judgment. For Spooked, immediately, almost out of the gate, we had a lot of people telling us their stories. Now, again, a lot of them is Granny saw a ghost, and that's not going to work for our show. And I think I want to say this as well. A lot of the stories that people send have deep personal significance to them or their families or their community. And just because it doesn't necessarily work in a spook context doesn't mean that it's not powerful for the people who are telling it to us. And we want to really respect that and honor that. What we're looking for at Spook, though, is actually a story. I lived with this experience. I responded. It responded back to me, and there's a bazillion ways where that can happen. But we're looking for something extended over time. We're looking for a different person at the end of the story than at the beginning. And yes, so right now, I'd say probably half of the stories that come to Spooked actually originated from listeners themselves, going to Spooked, sending us an email, spooked at snapjudgment.org, and saying this happened to me.
From a producer standpoint, do you think, well, I mean, just in a student of human behavior standpoint, do you think that it being an audio medium, and sorry, New York City outside, do you find it being this audio medium that people are a little bit more willing to open up because their face is not attached to it, and that again kind of separates them from the potential judgment, or people might listen to their story and not be like, oh, that's that guy Aaron. They can just listen to the tale.
There's definitely, I think for some people, yes, some people no. There's definitely though this intimacy with radio, this intimacy with audio. Oftentimes the people telling their stories, it might take us 5, 10, 12 hours of interviews, and those interviews are edited to make these stories to the stories that we actually broadcast. And I love it when someone says, "Oh, I'm so happy I told it like that." It makes me feel good because I know that you don't necessarily. We're able to, this team of producers that work on Spook is able to be, um, to keep the honesty of the story and the integrity of the person's story, even if they're not, let's say, a professionally trained storyteller. That ends up being a lot harder when you have a camera in your face. The editing is different and that type of thing. Audio makes all of this stuff plastic and allows us to focus on the things that really matter, the emotional impact of the stories. If you aren't affected yourself by whatever this paranormal experience is, if you have this crazy, amazing paranormal experience and you're like, Okay, what's for breakfast? Then that's not really going to work for us. We're looking for those stories that really we want you to hear in the person's voice their fear, their horror, and their wonder. I think this show in a lot of ways is really about wonder. That whatever you think your map of the universe is, we're going to scratch it a little bit and say maybe things don't work quite the way that we had thought. That there is magic still left in the world, and I think there's just power to just that.
Yeah, and it certainly makes the impact land. It impacts a little bit larger. I would say though, you used the word intimacy. Well, you yourself, you're not just coming in as a host that's throwing to story and bookending the episode. You share a lot of your own personal anecdotes at the top of each show, specifically, and they can be pretty crazy. And I have to admit, before I was familiar with you, I did reach a point where I started wondering if some of this is scripted, but this is real deal tales that you're telling. You actually have your own kind of background connected to these things.
I do. Um, so I grew up in the middle of an apocalyptic cult, and that was, we end of days Jesus cult, and demons and angels and all of this stuff was very, very real to us. Ghosts were very, very real to us. And I I was kind of joking, but I guess it's true to some extent. I grew up thinking that I was Harry Potter and everybody else was a muggle. And that world was real, very, very, very real for me. And but it's interesting though, even in retrospect, I've seen exorcisms. I somehow was gifted with the ability to do well witching. I have seen people who have passed talk to me, and it's I'm a modern person. I live in an urban environment. I could say you're tricked. You're a little kid. Um, when you saw that thing, you're in the middle of grief. Um, that couldn't be the way that that happened. I maybe maybe all those things could explain some of it, but some of it I don't think that it can, and I don't necessarily know that it's important that that sort of analysis. I know that these are lived experiences that I've been through that have really shaped who I am right now. And I do this at the top of the hour oftentimes to give license to whoever is out there experiencing their own thing, and not just necessarily in a supernatural context. Again, if you have someone who has like 100 of these stories, they're not generally someone we really are going to feature on the show. I've had a few things I think might qualify as supernatural, but most of the stories that you hear on the top of the show are not really don't wouldn't I don't think would classify as supernatural. They're more about leaning into the unexplained synchronicities. An example. This is something that happened a little while ago, and it's just funny. It's interesting to me. It's interesting to me. Call it supernatural, call it whatever you want to call it. But so it was just a few months ago. I got a phone call from my best friend who was laughing, and she's like, she's in a park And and another friend of hers, like looking at my son and said, look, 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 that's Roosevelt. And so she called me and she said, that's Roosevelt. And when she said it, I almost lost my stuff because Roosevelt, both of these people, they're dear, very, very dear to me. They knew before I had kids, before I was even in the picture, before this boy was even conceived or thought of, I had written this um, screenplay, or really a treatment. It was a little a kind of a character sketch of a character called Roosevelt, and this character was a militant African American vegan who went around the city trying to convince other people that they need to be vegan too. And I was I was laughing. I was like, and I told my friend, I was like, you know what? Think I think I wrote something on that. I think I wrote. She's like, no, you just wrote the character. It's like, I think I wrote something bigger. And I went and looked for it. Looked through my papers, looked through all my stuff, couldn't find it. Went through my email and stuff, and finally, I went. I was trying to. I had an old Yahoo account that I didn't even remember the password to, and I'm sitting there trying to do it. It's locking me out. And finally, I just closed my eyes and let my fingers put whatever they did into it, and the account opens up. And I go through it, type in Roosevelt, and this screenplay, a full-on screenplay, 120 pages of this character, and I had zero recollection of this whole thing. And I'm reading it like you would read it, like I don't know what's going to happen next. I'm reading this like whatever, and uh, I'm reading this. It's like my boy. This is my boy right here. He's using the same idioms and phrases, and he's motivated by the same things, and he's talking about veganism, and he's going to convince other people to do it. This is my boy. This is my boy before I had a boy. I'm wondering, where did this thing come from? Now, is that paranormal? Is that a ghost in the closet? No. But it makes me think, what came first? What where did the um how is this manifest? It's interesting to me. It's crazy interesting to me. And it's stories like that that oftentimes I'll start to, because all I'm trying to say is, you know what? I'll bet there's more magic in your world than you will give credence or credit to. I'll bet this isn't just me. That's the whole deal. I don't think it's just me. I think that by giving people permission to notice these things, to see these things, to make their own connections, I bet, I think I've been proven right. These stories just start flowing out of people, and that's who are writing us all the time. And the people, and I know, people have been so amazing and generous in telling us about how hearing either my story or someone else's story on the show inspires a conversation amongst people and their loved ones. And it really, I mean, what more does a storyteller want than to think that their story is inspiring someone to share a little bit of themselves with people they care about, and supernatural or not, and magical or not. But I do think a lot of these stories are magical.
Yeah, and I love the Roosevelt story. I do think I recall that you tell it in one of the episodes. It might be the episode where there's a creepy kid. I forget if that was it. It was a really good story, by the way. Roosevelt and the story that followed it. But and I like the point that, in my experience, yes, magic is around if you want it to be, if you want to believe in it, if you want to pursue it. Like, we can all be Harry Potter. It's more like being a muggle is a choice. In my experience. But the thing that I was fascinated by is that within the Western world, we have a certain approach and idea to ghost stories and then ideas of the paranormal. Sometimes it's very much connected to religion and faith. But you also studied in Japan, and it's interesting based on my travels how different cultures engage with these topics in different ways. How did that experience for you alter how you view all of this?
Um, I'm so glad you mentioned that because it changed everything. Everything. Um, so yeah, I mentioned that I grew up in a cult and I was trying to find my way away from it. I knew I needed some space, and I ended up applying to go to a program. I saw a back in the day at a laundromat. They had these little cards. We could say, it said, apply for fellowships to Asia, to China. And so I took one, made this little, and I applied to go. And they said it was a very prestigious fellowship, very prestigious. And they called me and said, I got it. And I was like, really? Prestigious fellowship? Me to China? How many people applied? Well, that's not important right now. What you did, this is prestigious fellowship. No, no, how many people applied? Well, you were the only one. And so you're going, you're going to China. What happened was Tiananmen Square happened. And
Oh,
they canceled everything that was going in and out of China. And I didn't, and I didn't know. I was just trying to get out of Dodge. And then they came back later and said, "Would you like to go to Japan instead? There's a new program going on there." I was like, "Look, I'm trying. You all understand me? I'm trying to get up out of here." So I went to Japan, the first year of a program called the Japan Center for Michigan Universities. And for me, it was maybe the most formative time period of my life. Um, and this was, several, it was, 25, 30 years ago now. I've talked to four of those people in the past 2 days. That's kind of my crew in a lot of ways. And but I was that whole experience of being I was in rural Japan, don't speak a word of anything, and trying my best to get on. Um, I'll just give you a side story. When I first, again, I'm trying to get away from this organization I grew up in. I'm trying to clear my head, and planes, trains. We're going to be moving to a small town in rural Japan. Also, this brand new program, and I don't speak a word of Japanese.
right.
I don't know how to use a Japanese phone. I don't know anything. I don't know the name of the town I'm moving to. My mama doesn't know how to get a hold of me. As I'm walking after this, we're getting planes, van, another train, a car, go to my apartment. I'm walking into my apartment in the rain, and the phone's ringing. And I thought I'm gonna surprise somebody when I pick it up. I pick it up. Hello, hello. Like, oh yes, this is so and so from the church. We understand you're in Japan now. We just want to let you know that there's meetings. These are people from my cult that I grew up in. They found my phone number before I knew my phone number, and I basically said, "I sorry, I don't can't hear you right now," and hung up the phone on them. But yeah, I was trying to get away, and they their arms and their fingers are everywhere.
Yeah.
But
Crafty.
crafty, and they got their own kind of magic. But um, yeah, the idea number one when I did start to learn how to speak Japanese, the idea of trying to explain my own beliefs in a language that I speak at best at the time as a toddler in, and you hear words coming out of your mouth, and you're like, "What am I talking about? Do I believe what I just said?" You speaking in a language you don't really know makes you think about what you're saying in a wholly different type of way, and and that was just not my kind of internal thing. The Japanese culture has their own approach to supernatural elements that are completely different than the approach that I had grown up with. And it's oftentimes too they're very nature and plant and place based in a way that is not the case, at least from my background. That this place, the this that the idea that every single thing has its own spirit, that this plant has a spirit, This chair has a spirit. This house has a spirit. These are all, and sometimes those spirits all work together, and sometimes they're in conflict. And seeing the world like that, it changes the way you experience the world on every single level. And I can just go on and on and on about this, but I definitely wanted to be a huge part of this show was an exploration. This is our these stories are our tool to explore and excavate different cultures, and I think that curious people will be interested in this storytelling approach. They want to understand what other cultures and communities think about the supernatural. The more of touch points you can have, the better maybe your own map will be. And that's the same way too. We don't have to go to Japan to do stories, which we do, but there's so many micro communities within the United States itself that see the world completely differently. A ghost hunter in Maine, or a farmer in Maine, let's say, is going to see something very, very different than a shopkeeper in New Orleans. Is going to see something very different than someone who a janitor in Michigan. Our own, we have a big sort of I hate to use the term melting pot, but we have a lot of different communities here, and it's interesting too when, which I love, 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 is when someone from one perspective or community experiences something from another perspective and community. That clash, whenever you have cultures living next to each other, you always get great food and you get fantastic stories.
I, I absolutely love that you brought that up because it's just something that I think about a lot, and I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit. But the you're so right because if I'm just looking for a lady in white, and that's if that's what I've been tuned into as far as what a ghost or a ghost story is about, then that's all I'm going to see, or maybe that's what I'll see, but that's the only thing I'm going to be tuned into. Now, and I agree that the more kind of exposure we have to other cultures and other culture stories, the our storytelling horizons broaden, and I think that that is a great thing. With that said, so much of specifically in the United States, so much of what dominates the ghost story, it looks a lot like me. It is dominated by, uh straight white Christian men. It's gotten a little bit better. TV has gotten a little bit better. I've been fortunate to be involved with projects that are a little bit more diverse, but it's still dominated by white dudes. Part of that is sure, we have to get better. We have to, force that diversity out there. But I have found with certain, communities, it's also a reluctance to talk about the paranormal and supernatural. I mean, you mentioned New Orleans. There are some really fascinating stories within Black communities there, but those stories aren't getting out. And these ghost stories are part of how we keep history alive. I say ghost stories are history demanding to be remembered, but it tells us about cultures and about communities. So that was a big windup to say, you know, speak to that a little bit. How do we kind of encourage communities, and they're not monolithic communities, I recognize that, but how do we encourage communities to be a little bit more willing to talk about these things, uh and and broaden that scope even more?
I think that one of the things, it's not necessarily that the community doesn't want to be open, it's that the community doesn't want to be exploited. And
Mm,
so often when you like the storytellers, who you've basically alluded to. You want to go in and take someone's story, twist it around for whatever purposes, and almost disparage the culture from which it came.
Yeah.
I know that for us, like, we've had to demonstrate to communities that we want to work with that we're serious about telling the story that they want to tell. And sometimes that's required real patience. It's required, in one case, 3 years of patience to tell a Native American skinwalker story the way that so that they would actually trust us to tell it. And a lot of that has been about, how are you treating everyone else?
Right.
How are you treating someone else's stories? And what does your staffing look like? Who are the people that are calling on me? Um, do they look like, do you have any sensitivity to this community? Do you know anything about it in the first place? Have you done enough homework so that certain things I don't have to explain to you, so that you understand from where these stories are coming from? This is really, really tricky and hard stuff. And it's not something you can oftentimes just parachute in and do. You have got to do that community work first before someone's going to open up their story to you, especially when we're talking, and this is something we love to do on Snap Judgment, but especially when you're talking about phenomena that are related to a particular community, sometimes a particular tribe, a particular area. Well, you're from where? From what? You want to tell this story so you can what with it? You got to like, and I do think a lot of story production is trust building. And if you're not willing to put that time in, then maybe it's right that these people, there's a history, such a long history of people's stories and their backgrounds being twisted, their legacies being tarnished, and what they've told people turning into the exact opposite. And so I'm hoping that at Snap Judgment Studios, all we can do is lean upon this history of how we've interacted in the past, even if we get it wrong, which we've gotten some things. We've made. Well, it's not like our organization is free of mistakes, but we want to tell. We want to tell the story that the person wants to tell. I don't have a gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I think someone is not telling me the truth, then maybe I'll play a little bit. But I'm not trying to twist the knife. I want to hear where you really, really came. I want to get a fuller understanding. I think it's because this is the whole deal. The I don't the biggest issue right now is, I think, in our country, maybe even globally, is that we don't understand. We refuse to understand each other. This lack of empathy, the inability to wear someone else's skin, to look through someone else's eyes, is literally destroying us. And the thing that is the antidote to that is storytelling. It might be the only antidote, because it's really, really hard to hate someone if you know their story. And we really want people to get inside someone else's experience, get inside their community's experience, because hopefully then they can see everyone as a person and not as a meme. That's a broader look at story. And that's the whole thing too. I think that I think that stories themselves are everything. This is what you watch something like Crossfire on TV, and you see two jackasses yelling at each other. No one in the history of the time has ever changed their mind about anything from watching that show. But I'll tell you what, people change their mind all the time by listening to someone else's story. They change like, wow, and even, and we're talking right now about paranormal stories. I think that, I'm going to have to give that a second look, or looking more into what you're talking about, or whatever it may be. You see people just kind of, huh, all the time. It happens. I just can't, like, it happens so often in this world of narrative. Because my former world was more of a political world. I just, it's a real magic. It's this cosmic thing that ties us together. Who knew that narrative is the way you get inside someone else's head? Um, who knew that these stories have a virality of their own? That if I tell you a story, not only will you tell that story to someone else, you might add your own story to it. That's that's magic. And it's really what the show's about.
I agree. I agree with what you're saying, and I really respect that too, because I've found that while I agree that right now it seems like we're just constantly butting heads and not seeing where one another is coming from, and there's this lack of empathy. When you get into the storytelling component, and then when you get into sort of the weird stories, something that I have found is it's almost like this expansion, like there's almost like a paradigm shift of people being willing to accept the potential for these other phenomena out there from other cultures. And I find that exciting, because if they're opening the door, whether they actively believe in it or not, but if they're opening the door for these other phenomena, the other kinds of high strangeness out there, opening the door for the legends of other people and the lore of other people and the personal stories, then that is a way of getting to know the people themselves, and hopefully avoiding falling into, turning them into tropes. That's obviously a big danger, but that's been fascinating for me. I really appreciate what you say on that. Uh, have you, through the course of these 6 seasons, have there been stories that you deemed perhaps too dark or too much? Because you're willing to go into some pretty dark places, and it's scary. You get spooked, but have you had to pull back on anything because you just thought it was too much?
Yeah, it happens a lot actually. And the rule has been for us that if we're going to tell a dark story, you better have a reason for it. You better make that reason worth, because the show really is immersive. We want to bring you with us. I don't want to drag someone through darkness without having a payoff of some degree that makes it worth what I just put you through. So we do have to pass on certain stories because we don't. And that's I say this. I said this before. I got to say it again. I can't really almost articulate how grateful I am that people share these stories with us. And it's not oftentimes that I don't want to disparage. If we don't use a story, it's not because that story might not be the most powerful and important thing to the person who's telling it to us, but we're trying to do a very small thing with our show. And so, and I've had to tell people, like, look, your story is an amazing story that just doesn't work for us. I I can't I can't in good conscience put take our listeners through what you just experienced. And but that doesn't mean I but we're giving you, I want to give you love at the same time. Like it's different. Like there's maybe there should be another show where you actually explore the trauma that people, because oftentimes what happens is that trauma and supernatural phenomena are oftentimes really closely linked. And it's just one of those things where I don't know. And to be able to tell the full story, let's just put it this way. People are suffering amazing trauma. When you, and I'll say this as well. I'll say this as well. If you walk down the street, 7 out of 10 people, and you ask them what their story is, their story, they will tell you a story of trauma. For women, it's higher. It will tell you a story of trauma. What's I think interesting about the whole process of storytelling is that it allows you to go back and maybe give yourself a different ending. Instead of being in that low place where your mind is telling you how the story ended, you can put yourself where in a different spot. And by telling your story that way, it ends up being a real type of healing. It's like, talk about magic again. That's magic. I've seen it again and again. People have said the story that I've been telling myself about myself, I've changed that story about me, and now this me is different. This me is more empowered. This me is more has a better ability to deal with what was going to come next. That it's a magical thing to be able to seize back control of your own story. And so, I'm sorry I'm being recursive with this, but off to tell the stories that in an honest way, oftentimes to do that honestly, you've got to go through the trauma that made everything happen in the first place. And sometimes that's not something that we're just willing to do on a show like ours.
Yeah. Well, we're winding down on time, but I am curious as far as looking ahead to these. You still have a lot of episodes left to go, and you're never going to stop. Are there any stories coming up for people that maybe have not yet subscribed or kind of are a little bit behind? Anything that you want to tease out that you're pretty excited about?
Oh, there's so much this season. It's
I know
just
you have so much on the way, so much content, so many
this
stories.
season is fire. But I would just say this: if you haven't heard the show before, start at the beginning. These are free. There are dozens of free episodes of whatever your podcast application might be. And I love it when the storytellers themselves. Sometimes we have, people who are used to telling stories. Everyone's had their own experience, and we have an actual storyteller say what happened to them. We have a story by Ray Christian, and it's about him as a child, and he used to train pigeons, and it's a story. I think it's just such a beautiful story. It takes you into a world that at least for me, I didn't know existed. And I love it when these stories do that. They just kind of forget the ghosts, forget anything like that. It takes you into a world that you just have never seen before. And I think you're going to find that with so many of these stories. Some of them are so beautiful, um, narratively, and some of them are really scary. And some of them, again, they will make you question everything that you thought you knew about the world you live in.
I will say that yes, I would say going back to the beginning. I pretty much when I discovered it, it was in 2017, and it was a strong show out of the gate. And the thing that hooked me early on was I don't know, it was maybe not even was technically a ghost story, but it was a story of something quite strange. And that's the one that when I tell people about this show, I kind of refer back to. So I think it's always fun to kind of have your favorites on Spooked. And because look, it is Halloween season, spooky season. What do you do Halloween? What are your Halloween plans? Are there any movies or anything that you need to revisit during this time? I definitely see some key art from Spooked where you look like Candyman. So lay it on me. Glynn
I
Washington and Halloween.
When watching Halloween, honestly, people will be surprised at this. I'm not that guy. I'm not Mr. Watch horror movies all the time and on all that kind of stuff. What I do, we there's a island community here, Alameda, where the rich people live, and go trick or treating out there because they hand out the big candy bars
Oh yeah.
for my kids. And there's a particular street, and it is just so much fun because I'm guessing they've been working on their yard uh, situation for the past 6 or 7 months. Last year, the Halloween, the scariest thing possible was all of this. It was a Trump evil Halloween. You had uh, uh, Mike Pence jumping up at you, and it was scary. It was horrifying. Clarence Thomas coming behind the band, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do this year. I mean, you know, I love forget. I want to put all that stuff down. I'm lived oftentimes in this supernatural world where I'm hearing these stories that I'm like, whoa, all the time. When it gets to Halloween itself, I want to have a mug or something. I want to put on some good cheer, and let's go knock on some doors.
All right. That does sound scary, by the way, that house. All right. Well, Glynn Washington, I appreciate your time. I'm going to ask you to hang out backstage for a second as we wrap things up, and I'll be back with you. But Glynn Washington, host, creator, executive producer of Spooked, as well as Snap Judgment, which can be checked out on the Luminary podcast network. So, Glynn Washington, thank you so much for your time, my friend.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And guys, like I said, to listen to all the newest episodes of Spooked as they are released, subscribe to the Luminary channel on Apple Podcast. You can also listen at the Luminary site or by downloading the Luminary app. There are some number of episodes that are available for free on all streaming platforms, but that is just a taste, a little appetizer of what is out there for you to check out. So Glynn Washington, he was excellent guest, man. I could listen to him talk all day long. But we got to go. So with that said, I want to say happy Halloween to all of you guys. Happy spooky season. Thank you for joining my spooky nerds, my Den of Geek fans. We have a lot more content like this out there and a lot more on the way. So keep those eyeballs peeled. And you can also catch up with me across social media at Aaron Sagers on Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel and Discovery Plus, and on the Ripley's, believe it or not, YouTube channel with the Ripley's Road Trip web series. So wherever you may be, keep it weird and stay spooky.